Hey there, welcome back to my channel. I'm a former Seventh-day Adventist and a Christian apologist, and what we'll be doing today is we'll be continuing on the issue of the Sabbath. I have a part 1 video. If you haven't watched the part 1 as yet, I suggest you do so before you get to this one. And I also did a study on the law and the covenants, a 3-part series on the law and the covenants. It would do well for you to actually look at those videos if you haven't done so as yet, and check out my video where I talk about my video titled "What Did Jesus Bring to the Cross?" Subscribe to my channel and you will find all the videos that I have done thus far up till now. Right now, as said just now, we are continuing on the issue of the Sabbath. In my previous video, I looked at 16 objections as to why Seventh-day Adventists and Sabbatarians believe that the Sabbath spoken of in Colossians 2 verse 16 is not the weekly Sabbath. I look at 16 objections and I show you how these objections cannot work. So in this video, we'll be looking at 16 more if that's possible, because I have 48. We're looking at 48 objections. I've done 16 already, and I'm hoping to do 16 more in this video. Right? Now, in the previous video, I'll just give a quick recap by highlighting one point, one of the objections, which I think is their main objection as to why they believe it's not the weekly Sabbath. But personally speaking, I think that objection is the one that proves more than anything else that the Sabbath they are spoken of is the weekly Sabbath. The objection number 1 that I mentioned of that, they said that because it said Sabbath days there, it's talking the ceremonial, so-called ceremonial Sabbaths, and not the weekly Sabbath. But you saw that arguments cannot work, for the plural Sabbath days in the King James Version is used. Sabbath days is used 9 times in the New Testament. 8 out of the 9 times, everyone agrees that it's the weekly Sabbath. But the final time, Sabbatarians have it to say that that's not the weekly Sabbath, it's a ceremonial Sabbath. And that is inconsistent. If all 9 times and up until the 8th time it means the weekly Sabbath, wouldn't you think that the final occurrence is also the weekly Sabbath? The answer to that is yes. Consistency would demand that it be the weekly Sabbath. Right? So that's one of the main arguments that they use, and it's the one that proves more than anything else that it is the weekly Sabbath spoken of there. Right? But with no further ado, let's go on to looking at the other objections that they use to reject the teaching of Colossians chapter 2, that we shouldn't be judged by Sabbath, by the Sabbath, right? Now, before I do so, I'm going to have a short word of prayer, right? I'm not sure, I don't believe I had actually prayed in my previous video, but please see with me, there are times when my mind it's just not here at times, and currently I'm not feeling so well either, right? I'm having the flu, but I'm actually pushing myself to do this video, right? So let us begin. Most kind and compassionate Father, as we are about to enter into another phase of study, I pray, Lord, that you will open the minds of my viewers, enable them to see what it is that you want them to see, cause them to understand everything that is being said, and may everything resonate with them and remain in them. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Alright, here's the 17th objection, objection number 17. 1 John 3 verse 4, where it says, whosoever committed sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is a transgression of the law. Now, the NKJV, the New King James Version, reads differently from the KJV in this text, as well as NASB, ESV, and the Amplified Version. All says something different from the KJV. The KJV, I would say, is a bad translation of this text, as it gives an impression that the 10 Commandments is still binding, which cannot be based on the evidence given. I would give the NKJV the thumbs up for a better translation, although Adventists will not accept this, despite many translations showing otherwise, since they are KJV only is. Right? KJV only is, meaning they think KJV is the most accurate translations, and that no other translation should be used in place of KJV. You have a lot of persons who have this mindset, and the term that is used to call them is KJV only is. Right? I'm just letting you know what KJV only is mean. There is no perfect translation. Let me just say that before I continue. If one checks the Greek word for the law mentioned in that text, you will see it's anomia, which is a different word from the law mentioned in Romans 7, which is namas. Namas definitely means the law of the old covenant, right? However, anomia does not. And this is why other translation reads differently from the KJV and is a better translation. For certainly the text there, when it says whosoever sin transgresseth also the law, it is not talking the 10 Commandments, that it would be inaccurate to say transgresseth also the law, which would imply that it's talking 10 Commandments or law of Moses. No, the word there is anomia, not namas. You understand? And that is why other translations are a better rendering of the text than the KJV. And if they want to stick to KJV, fine. But you can't say that it's saying that whosoever committed sins transgresseth 10 commandments. For the Greek word mentioned there is not talking 10 commandments or none of the law of Moses. Right? It's namas. Namas is the word used when speaking of the law of Moses. Now, objection number 18. James 1 verse 25 and James 2 verse 8 to 12 and James 4 verse 11. These are passages that will be used to say that it can't be the weekly Sabbath spoken of in Colossians 2 verse 16. Now these passages of scriptures are the most complex, I must admit. It out of all is the best arsenal 10 commandment promoters have to use, for it seems that the 10 commandments is still active. It should be noted though that if it is, then there would be a contradiction. What then is James saying? The first thing to note is that James was writing to the scattered Israelites, the 12 tribes who are Jacob's son. Genesis 49 verse 1 to 2 and 28. And James 1 verse 1. Look at those and you'll understand why James is writing this letter to the scattered tribes of Israel, to whom the law and the covenants was given according to Romans 9 verse 3 to 4. With this in mind, it's safe to say James was not saying the 10 commandments was still active, but rather used it to bring across a few points. The fact that he says, if they fulfill the royal law, which is to love your neighbor, you do well, verse 8, is evident. Paul is showing them that this law is what matters. No, let me read that back. The fact that he says if they fulfill the royal law, which is to love your neighbor, you do well, is evident that James is showing them that this law is what matters. For from verse 1 to 7 of chapter 2, he mentions of some partiality displayed by them, which is not love, and as such is deemed as a transgressor of the law, right? For according to verse 9. For the end or goal of the law is love, 1 Timothy 1 verse 5. And since they are acquainted with the law, they would already know that if they break one, they break all, according to James 2 verse 10 to 11. James is using the law to teach them something. For notice from verse 12 onwards, James began to express a truth which can be summed up by saying one should love their neighbor as themselves, which shows the true essence of faith. This love is the royal law he mentioned in a few verses before, verse 8. And Therefore, this must also be the law of liberty, spoken of in James 1 verse 25 and James 2 verse 12. James speaks of, therefore this must also be the law of liberty, spoken of in James 1 verse 25 and James 2 verse 12, which James is speaking of, and cannot be anything else, such as the 10 Commandments, as many would assume. And to further prove this, notice in James 1 verse 25, in 2 verses after he talked about the perfect law of liberty, he mentions about visiting the fatherless and the widow. In a verse before, he mentions of controlling the tongue, which can be used to love the neighbor and deeply hurt them as well. Something he would elaborate on in chapter 3 verses 8 to 9. The same in James 2 verse 12, when he mentions the law of liberty, he immediately got to the subject of love. And to further hit the nail on the edge, in Galatians 4 verse 21 to 31, Paul likens the old covenant, which is the 10 Commandments, to the bondwoman, and says we are not of the bondwoman. The 10 Commandments for him was bondage. So how then can it be the law of liberty, which is opposed to bondage? It certainly cannot, for either it's bondage or it's liberty, but it can't be both. So those passages used in James to say 10 Commandments is still valid, and so it can't be the ceremonial, it can't be the weekly Sabbath spoken of in Colossians 2 verse 16, cannot work. I just did an exegetical study on what James is saying to you, and you see that certainly not, that James can't be used to say that it's not the Sabbath spoken of in Colossians 2, not the weekly Sabbath, right? Now, objection number 19. The Sabbath was before Sinai and sin. Therefore, it is eternal, and so it must be kept now. Note, it is God. Now, here's my refutation. Note, it is God who rested from his work, as the scriptures said. What would Adam be resting from if he rested on the so-called Sabbath of creation? He was created on the 6th day and would not have been working 6 days prior to the first Sabbath that Sabbatarians are talking about. For after all, the 4th commandment says, 6 days you shall do your labor and rest on the 7th day. It's logical Adam wouldn't qualify, since he was never working 6 days. The first Sabbath would then have no significance to him. Also, he had no hard labor like us. For according to the Bible, it's in Genesis 3, after sin he was given work. Sabbatarians' point on this cannot hold water, just like their other arguments. Also, on the Sabbath there are many do's and don'ts, many of which would not apply to him given the situation. He had no need to buy, as everything was given to him freely, nor did he have a need to sell. And if he did, he would only have Eve to buy and sell from, for which there would be no need, since they are husband and wife, and husband and wives don't buy and sell from each other. And they both were given all things, so there was no need for them to buy anything. They had no need to work, since they only ate fruits before sin. No need to wash clothes, since they never wore any, and were naked. Sabbath just would not be applicable to them as it were to Israel. For God gave Israel Sabbath so they could enjoy rest, as being in bondage. Good rest would be strange to them, as they served the Egyptians with rigor, according to Exodus 1 verse 13. That it came to God's attention, according to Exodus 3 verse 7. So rest would be something of great significance to them. Not to Adam, though, who had no work, and not to us, who were never in slavery. Thus it cannot be said that Adam and Eve were given Sabbath as a command after creation. It is better to say they were given it after they had sinned, and that they can't prove either. Only only one commandment were given them, and that was not to eat from one of the trees which you know about already. Right? From Genesis 1 to 3, I believe. Somewhere in that line they were told not to eat from a particular tree. No, objection number 20. The Sabbath is perpetual, and so it is to be kept now. And they'll use Exodus 31 verse 16 to suggest this. Well, if it being perpetual means I have to keep it, well then one can justify the Catholics having priests now by that analogy. For the priest's office was a perpetual statute according to Exodus 29 verse 9. They then can use the same argument and say that the priest's office is perpetual. The Levites in Israel may just well continue the priestly services. Another weak argument, for if you check, you will see that many things that are said to be perpetual in the Old Testament are done away now. And I leave my reader to research this. Perpetual doesn't mean that it can never end, but simply means for all time until or unless God says otherwise. That is what perpetual means. Now let's look at objection number 21. The Sabbath is a sign. The Sabbath is a sign forever, so it must be kept now. And they'll use Exodus 31 verse 17 to prove this. The Passover, here's my refutation to this now. The Passover is forever, according to Exodus 12 verse 14. And it no longer is kept now, because Jesus, who is the Passover, who the Passover was symbolic of, replaced that, according to 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7. Many other things are said to be a statute forever, and yet it is not, and yet is not kept now. Therefore, that idea of Sabbath being kept because it is forever cannot stand. If you say that the Sabbath is forever and so we have to keep it now, you have to say that we have to keep the Passover now, because the Bible did say it is forever as well, right? You can't take one and leave the other. That's inconsistency, right? You have to go with both. So what it means then is that when the Bible says forever, as I said before, it means until God says otherwise, or for all time until God says otherwise. Until or if God says otherwise, that is what forever oftentimes means. Now let's look at objection number 22. Isaiah 56 verse 1 to 6 shows that the Sabbath was not just for Israel. They'll use this text to say that the Sabbath was not just for Israel, but this text doesn't help them at all. And I'll show you why. Actually, it doesn't. Here's my refutation, right? For them saying that the Sabbath was not just for Israel. Actually, it doesn't. For notice in verse 3 it says, the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord. And then verse 4, the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths and take hold of my covenant. Those statements are key in understanding what is being said. For the Sabbath to be applicable to anyone, they must join themselves to the Lord and take hold of his covenant. Then and only then is it required for them. For whatever law was for Israel, the same law would be for those that joins Israel and choose to worship Israel's God, according to Exodus 12 verse 49, Leviticus 24 verse 22, and Numbers 15 verse 16 and 29. And as I said before, the other nations were never punished for not keeping the Sabbath or any of the ritual or ceremonial laws or diet laws. Only the moral aspects of the law they were punished for, thus showing Sabbath was a ritual law as well as the diet laws, so they both were exclusive to Israel. Only when one joins himself to the Lord and become a part of the covenant would they be required to keep the Sabbath and diet laws. Another point I should make from Isaiah 56 is that in verse 3 it says, "Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, The Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, Behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord, unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbath, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant, even unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place, and a name better than of sons and of daughters. And I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." Right? So you notice that God says that the stranger, do not let the stranger say, "The Lord has utterly separated me from his people." Why would the stranger say the Lord has utterly separated me from his people if they don't feel somewhat of a separation from God's people? In my study where I talk about what did Jesus bring to the cross, one of the things I pointed out that the law of commandment contained in ordinances, according to Ephesians 2, it caused a middle wall of partition, a separation between Jew and Gentiles. Right? And so the Sabbath, if you look into this, it's talking about Sabbath, Sabbath was one of the things that caused a separation between Jews and Gentiles, spoken of here in Isaiah 56. This is why the stranger says that I am utterly separated from God's people. Because when they come into the camp of Israel, let's say Israel doing so many things that they are not familiar with, they are not accustomed to, so they feel isolated, they feel separated from God and his people. Now this is a huge dent in Sabbatarians' theology. For if it is that the Sabbath was not applicable just to the Jews alone, how is it that the Gentiles feel separated? If it wasn't something that's a Jewish ordinance, right? They wouldn't feel separated. They would be able to identify with them, right? Surely they would be able to identify with them if it was that the Sabbath was not a Jewish ordinance, right? Now, if they say that it was given to them from Sinai onwards, wouldn't the Gentiles know about it and be familiar with it? Definitely, and the strangers wouldn't feel separated. Right? And not only that, whenever they break God's Sabbath, God would have punished them for doing such. He punished them for other sins, but never for breaking Sabbath. There's only one explanation for this. God doesn't expect them to know anything about Sabbath. Right? That's the only explanation. God wouldn't look to discipline anyone for something that they don't know. That would be wicked. How can you be punishing me for something that I don't know about? You understand? And the only way, and this alone proves that the Sabbath is a ceremonial law. When they commit idolatry, they steal, they kill, and they do all manner of evil, God punish them. Right? And the reason for this is that God expects them to know better. Whatever is moral, we are expected to know better. But when things that are ceremonial, there's no way we can know we can know better. Right? So this argument of theirs from Isaiah 56 doesn't help them at all. It actually shows that the Sabbath was a Jewish ordinance. Now I'll continue. Objection number 23. Jesus, when on earth, he referred to the 10 commandments, spoken of in Matthew 19, 16 to 19, Mark 10, verse 17 to 19, and Luke 18, verse 18 to 20, thus proving it is still binding. Well, Jesus never only referred to the 10 commandments, but he also made reference to things written by Moses other than the 10 commandments. Right? Luke 10, verse 25 to 28, Mark 12, verse 28 to 33, Matthew 22, verse 35 to 40, right? Which is a quotation of Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 and 5, and Leviticus 19, verse 18. Does this mean that the 10 commandments are still in force? Certainly not. Right? For Christ pointed to many things out of the law which are no longer valid now, and I will give an example. In Matthew 8, verse 1 to 4, Mark 1, verse 40 to 44, and Luke 5, verse 12 to 14, these Gospels record the one and the same event where Jesus healed a man with leprosy and then referred him to the priest according to the law. And note, though, that those times where Christ drawed reference to the 10 commandments is all one and the same event recorded by the 3 Gospels. And it's the same event. It's the same event when Jesus draw reference to the law when he healed the man with leprosy. And yet, if persons are healed from leprosy today, although that disease is no longer in our time, he would not have a priest to go to unless you buy the Catholic fallacy of having priests. Because the priestly services are done away with. Thus, showing that not because Christ made reference to the 10 commandments doesn't mean it has to be binding today. If you say that because Christ made reference to the 10 commandments is binding today, you have to say that the priestly office is binding today. Right? By the same standard, because Jesus did make reference to those laws as well. Right? So that argument can't work either. Now let's look at number 24. Argument number 24. Christ kept the Sabbath, so we should keep it too. And the fact he did proves it's meant to last forever and should be kept now. Here's my refutation on that. Well, if that's the case, we should be keeping all the ceremonial laws that he kept, like Passover, which we find in Luke 22 verse 1 and onwards, and the others as well. And that would mean they are all supposed to be eternal. No doubt that line of thinking is weak, for Christ had to keep all of the law because he was born under the law. Hence, he had to keep the Sabbath. Objection number 25. The disciples kept the Sabbath after Christ's death, so we must keep it too. Well, there is no biblical proof that the disciples or Gentiles kept the Sabbath. For although Paul and them met on the Sabbath, that doesn't prove they kept Sabbath. More than it proves that people who go church on Saturday actually keep Sabbath. For many go church on Saturday and don't keep Sabbath. I've yet to meet an Adventist who truly keeps Sabbath how they ought to keep it. Right? As a former Adventist, I know this better than a Sunday worshipper ever can. For going to church on Sabbath or Saturday doesn't mean you are keeping it, as Sabbath is much more complicated than that. Why then does Paul do his ministry on Sabbath? Well, it's simple. In 1 Corinthians 9 verse 19 to 23, Paul made something very interesting for us to think about. For based on what he said, it could be argued that he uses Sabbath as a way to win the Jews who were under the law and nothing more. For the Jews were very adamant about the law, according to Acts 18 verse 12 to 13, not understanding that the law has changed, according to Hebrews 7 verse 12. How careful then would Paul have to be to ensure he is not showing disregard for the Sabbath, even if it is no more a requirement? But in order to win them, he made himself under the law to win the Jews who are still under it and won't give it up, according to 1 Corinthians 9 verse 20. Cross-reference what I'm saying with that. An example of this is found in Acts 16 verse 1 to 3, where Paul circumcised Timothy, which the text says clearly he did because of the Jews, as they were adamant about that. We find that in Acts 15 verse 1 and onwards, which Paul lets us know that it is no longer necessary to circumcise, according to Galatians 5 verse 1 to 6, but he does it to please the Jews. You understand? So I can argue that if Paul is there on Sabbath, he does it to please the Jews and he does it for missionary work. That is not evidence to say that he kept it, right, because he's seen on the Sabbath, or that the Sabbath is supposed to be kept now because he was seen on the Sabbath. That argument can't work. No, Paul did it to the Jews, but he did it so the Jews, that is circumcised on Timothy, he did it so the Jews won't be on his neck. It can be said then that he met with the Gentiles on Sabbath to not have the Jews on his neck. Yet Paul met up for the first time to break bread with the disciples on the first day of the week, according to Acts 20 verse 7. The first and only time recorded, and it's the first day and not the Sabbath day. Wow! And not only that, Jesus, after his resurrection, always met with them on the first day of the week. See Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, and John chapter 20 to 21. In all the four Gospels, and I recommend my reader to read the book of John, chapter 20 and 21, and they will see that Jesus more than had a chance to visit them on the Sabbath, yet he skipped a Sabbath and came on the first day. It's almost as if he forgot about it. But seeing from the Old Testament how important the Sabbath is, I wonder how can that be, that Jesus would forget about the Sabbath. It is very much clear by that act alone that the Sabbath is no longer important. For if it was, wouldn't that be? For if it was, right? Wouldn't that be the best day to visit them? That's a question for you to think about. I leave my reader to think about this. Now in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 to 23, in verse 21, Paul said something very important, that in dealing with those who are without the law, which is the Gentiles, he made himself without the law. But he made a distinction and said while he did that, he was not without the law to God, but under the law to Christ. So this means he paid no heed to the law of Moses when dealing with the Gentiles that are without the law, but gives heed to the law of Christ that he said he was under, so that he could win the Gentiles to Christ. For the Gentiles wouldn't be acquainted with many of the laws of Moses, nor accustomed to them, and so it would be burdensome to them, which is something the Jews constantly tried to burden them with. And you can see Acts 15 for that. The law of Christ was much simpler, which is just the love. And that law he worked with when dealing with the Gentiles. And he made it clear that this is the law he is under, which being under makes him still being with the law to God. Since the law of Christ is the law of God. Right? Since the law of Christ is the law of God, God still, as I showed already. But as for the law of Moses, that wasn't in Paul's book. He only keep it sometimes to win the stubborn Jews. Now is the Sabbath the law of Moses or Christ? It is the law of Moses, for it is given through Moses. John 1 verse 17. And Christ, all the while on earth, never once told any to keep the Sabbath or made reference to it, while he made reference to many other laws and told people to keep those laws. And to have forgotten about it after his resurrection, well, it seems to me he knew from the beginning it was gonna be put back, and it was gonna be put on the back burner. I leave this also for you to think about. Right? Now, for objection number 26. Objection number 26. Christ kept the Sabbath to his grave, showing how important it is and should be in the future, for he kept it in his grave. This is an argument that they'll use to say that it's not the Sabbath spoken of in the weekly Sabbath spoken of in Colossians 2. Now here's my refutation to that. Well, Christ kept every law to his grave, and him being dead leaves him with no choice but to rest. But if one wants to use that argument, I can say he rose on the first day, which would suggest a new beginning, and decades after, he visited his beloved disciples, who was the last one remaining, on the first day, again, which is called the Lord's Day, Revelation 1 verse 10, which history proves to be the first day of the week. So if you want to say he kept it in his grave, which he had no choice to do, by the way, you have to say then, I can say then, boy, he rose on the first day of the week, so chances are that's the day that it is of more importance now, for the first day would usher in a new beginning. Third also, can anyone actually keep anything while they're dead? How can a dead person actually keep a law? Does that even make sense? Once you're dead, there's nothing you can do. So Christ has no other choice but to be there, not moving or anything, because he's dead. A dead person cannot keep anything. No, this is one of the silliest arguments that they have. But nevertheless, you see that this argument can't work either. We are down to about 5 or 6 more arguments. Objection number 27. In the 4th commandment, it said, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Therefore, it must have been previously commanded, and that must be at creation, thus proving its immutability. Negative. Just because someone said, remember, doesn't mean it was something you have said before. And I will give an example. My brother is leaving for school tomorrow, during a rainy season. And he takes his lunch with him before he leaves. However, I say to him while he was leaving to remember to take your umbrella. Does this mean remember to take your umbrella? Does this mean I had told him before? Absolutely not. Now, if one wants to cling to that argument, fine. Because Exodus 16 defeats their argument still. For if God had told them about Sabbath before that, they must keep. If God had told them about Sabbath before that, they must keep it, then it would. Sorry, let me repeat that. Sorry. Yes, for if God had told them about Sabbath before that they must keep it, then it would have to be from Exodus 16 and not any time before that. Him saying remember would have to be because he told them before in Exodus 16 and not at creation. And I need not say more based on what I show already, that the Sabbath was not given as a law at creation. Now for objection number 28. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man according to Matthew 2 verse 27. Therefore it must have been given as a command to keep from creation. Negative, and here's my refutation to that. Every law that God has ever given was for man, and yet it's undeniable that not all the laws were from creation. I can show many that one cannot argue that this was given during the time of Moses and not at creation. But I will just show one alone and leave you to think. In Leviticus 18, it makes mention of not coming near to one in Leviticus 18 it mentions of not coming near to one that is near of kin to you. Right, verse 6. That is a family member. But at creation, people had to populate. For Cain and Seth, which is Adam's son, had to find wives in order to multiply. And so would his other children. And how would they do this? They have to marry each other, even though they were related, and this is how the earth populates, which is why we are all ultimately related. The same with Noah and his family. And Abraham and Sarah were brother and sisters, according to Genesis chapter 12 and chapter 20. Yet it was not a sin, as God himself sanctioned it, and he never reproved Abraham for it. During the time of Moses, he stopped this, and I can see why, for by then the earth would be populated enough so one wouldn't and shouldn't go near to their king anymore. Right? That law in Leviticus 18 was made for man, yet no doubt it was not given at creation. Why then must one assume Sabbath was given at creation because it was made for man? This argument is just another weak argument that cannot work. Right, now let's look at objection number 29. We are almost finished. The Sabbath was instituted at creation. Therefore it stands forever because of this, and it cannot change. Here's my refutation to that. Again, it was not given at creation, but let's give Sabbatarians the benefit of the doubt and say it was. Would that mean it has to be kept now and that it is immutable? Well, marriage was instituted at creation, and whereas there is no evidence of the Sabbath given as a law at creation, there is evidence of marriage given as a law at creation. See Genesis 2 verse 23 to 24. It is made clear by Paul that one doesn't have to marry if they don't want to, according to 1 Corinthians 7 verse 1 to 9. By this claim of Adventists, Paul would be a false prophet to be telling someone to not marry when marriage was instituted at creation. Since once a thing is instituted at creation before Sinai, it's immutable. It's funny how there is evidence of marriage being instituted at creation, and yet we don't have to get married if we don't want to. And there is no evidence of Sabbath being instituted or given as a law at creation, and yet we have to keep it. How silly is this argument? Not only can it not hold water, but it can't hold air. LOL. Okay, objection number 30. We are down to 3. Objection number 30. At Sinai, God used himself as an example as he rests. So should they. And this proves it was given as a law at creation. Negative. Just because he used himself as an example, does not mean it was given as a law at creation. Right? I don't think I have to say much on that one. Objection number 31. At creation, God blessed and sanctified it. And with this twofold thing done, it proves he must have given them the Sabbath as a law then, and that it must be kept now. Well, according to the writer of Hebrews, marriage is honorable, which is the same as blessed, right? And the bed is undefiled, which in the Greek means pure, which is the same as sanctified or hallowed, right? Marriage is of the same caliber as well as the seventh day at creation. Marriage is of the same caliber as was the seventh day at creation. And if one wants to assume by this that it must have been given as a law that man must keep Sabbath at that time, and therefore being given before sin, it's immutable, and therefore given before sin proves its immutability. What Paul said about marriage in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 1 to 9 utterly destroys that idea. Even if the Sabbath was given at creation, which cannot be proven, it doesn't mean it has to be kept now, as marriage was no doubt given at creation, and it does not have to be kept or done now. Right? So now let's look at the final objection. Objection number 32. In Genesis chapter 26 verse 5, God said, Abraham kept his commandments and his laws, thus showing the 10 commandments existed before Sinai. Negative. Of the 10 commandments, which is the old covenant, according to Deuteronomy 4 verse 10 to 13, God made it known that this was not made with the fathers, according to Deuteronomy 5 verse 2 to 4, who are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, according to Exodus 3 verse 15. Hence, the commandments and laws mentioned cannot be talking about the 10 commandments, for Abraham was not given the 10 commandments. The charge mentioned would have to be leave his home and go to the place he know not. According to Genesis 12 verse 1 to 3. And the statutes would have to be the erecting of altars to worship the Lord and offer burnt offerings, which he did often, according to Genesis 12 verse 6 to 8 and Genesis 13 verse 3 to 4 and 14 to 18. Right? As he would have learned that from Noah, Genesis 8 verse 20, being a descendant of his. The commandments and laws would have to be in relation to circumcision, which God told him about, and in offering up his son, right, in Genesis 22. If one studies Abraham's life, they will see that he was very obedient. He was very obedient to God, giving God all right to say what he said about him. But was it the 10 commandments he was referring to? Certainly not. That desperate attempt to push the Sabbath just doesn't work at all. Right? So I've done 16 more objections as to why they believe that the Sabbath spoken of in Colossians 2 is not the weekly Sabbath. It is not the weekly Sabbath. I've already gone through 32 objections, and I show you how easily those objections can be refuted. None of the 32 can actually work. Now stay tuned for my part 3 my final video where I show 16 more to complete the 48 objections, right? I'm going to show 16 more and show you how none of them can't work. So by the time I'm finished, you will be certain without a shadow of a doubt that the Sabbath spoken of there is the weekly Sabbath, right? Now I do hope you enjoy this video. If you have, please like, comment where necessary, subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon so that you can receive notifications whenever I make new uploads. And last but not least, share this video with whom you know will benefit from an amazing video like this. Bye bye now.